We are taught from childhood, like pretty much from day one, that the family is our ultimate sanctuary.
Right, it's the foundation of everything.
Exactly. This is supposed to be the safety net that catches us when the world falls apart. We build our entire lives around this foundational idea. But what if that exact structure wasn't a safety net at all?
That's a huge question.
What if the traditional family is actually a trap? Like literally a time bomb just waiting to be detonated by society?
I mean, it is a profoundly unsettling question to ask, let alone to try and actually prove. But that is exactly the premise we are exploring today.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking you into a translated 2020 essay by a writer named Xu Feng. The piece is titled Enlightenment from the Phenomena of Yang Galan and Wu Huaiyan. And as that opening hook suggests, this journey goes to some unexpectedly profound and, frankly, highly challenging places.
Yeah, to make a claim radical enough that it questions the very concept of the family, Shofeng clearly isn't looking at, standard sanitized census data or economic reports. He builds his entire framework around a methodology he calls reading books without words.
I love that. I find that phrasing so evocative.
It really is.
Because usually, when we want to understand societal flaws, we crave quantifiable data, right? We want it charted out and nicely bound in a sociology textbook.
We want the math to make sense of the tragedy.
Exactly. But Shufeng argues that if you want the most authentic, unfiltered information about the human condition, you have to throw those traditional books away. You have to read society directly by observing raw, unedited human phenomena.
Because official numbers often sanitize suffering. They turn human despair into a neat little percentage point on a graph. Shofeng argues that true spiritual enlightenment, like a genuine awakening to how we are living, only comes from looking unflinchingly at the lived realities of people at the margins.
And the books without words he chooses to read in this essay are absolutely devastating.
They really, really are.
We're going to explore how the author uses two extreme real-world tragedies to build his critique of modern society, and ultimately to propose a highly unconventional alternative way of living.
Right.
Now, before we really get into the weeds here, because this text takes a very sharp turn from sociological observation into distinct ideology, I need to lay down some ground rules for you listening.
Good call.
This source material contains politically charged critiques of government reliance, and it culminates in some very specific spiritual and communal ideologies. So I want to be crystal clear up front. Neither of us are taking sides or endorsing the author's viewpoints today.
Right, we're strictly neutral here.
We are acting as impartial guides. We're here to convey the ideas contained in the original text, to understand this author's unique perspective, and to just unpack the underlying logic he uses.
We are examining the architecture of his argument, not validating the blueprint. It is a fascinating text to study, regardless of whether you agree with its ultimate conclusions or the communal lifestyle it pitches.
So let's start with the foundation of his argument, which relies on the real lives of two specific individuals. First, Yang Gailan.
Right.
In 2016, she was a 28-year-old woman living in a rural village who, in a state of sheer, absolute desperation, took the lives of her 4 young children and then ended her own life.
It's just an unimaginable, harrowing tragedy, and it completely shocked the public when it happened.
And then there's the second person he focuses on, Wu Huaiyan. She was a 24-year-old junior in college.
Yeah.
And according to the text, she survived for 5 years, eating essentially nothing but rice mixed with chili because that was all she could afford.
For 5 years, just rice and chili.
Yeah, she was trying to save every single penny for her sick brother. She ultimately died of illness, and at the time of her death, poverty had ravaged her body to the point where she weighed just 43 kilograms. That is about 94 pounds.
Wow. And what's fascinating here is how Xuefeng categorizes these two devastating events. It would be very easy, and perhaps comforting in a dark sort of way, to look at these as freak occurrences,
Yeah, like isolated incidents.
Exactly. We desperately want to believe that tragedies of this magnitude are just glitches in an otherwise functioning system. But Xuefeng refuses to give us that comfort. He explicitly calls the deaths of Yang Gailan and Wu Huaiyan a common social phenomenon.
See, I struggled with that terminology at first. He calls them extreme yet typical. And to me, that feels like a massive contradiction.
How so?
Well, how can an outlier so extreme that it makes national news also be typical of society? It just seems counterintuitive.
It does, but the contradiction resolves when you look at the underlying mechanics rather than just the final horrific outcome. His argument is that the structural pressures that ultimately crush these two women exist absolutely everywhere.
Oh, I see.
We just rarely hear about them until they reach this absolute tragic breaking point. For every Yang Gailan or Wu Huaiyan that makes the news, there are countless others silently enduring the exact same systemic pressures, just barely managing to hold on.
Right. He actually uses this brilliant analogy of a time bomb to explain this dynamic, and I think this is crucial for you listening to understand his approach.
It really frames the whole essay.
He deliberately avoids analyzing what he calls the internal causal logic, meaning he flat out refuses to dissect the personal psychology, the fate, or the mental fortitude of these specific women.
Which is how the media usually handles these stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
Asking what was wrong with them psychologically.
Exactly. But he explicitly notes that blaming their internal capacity to cope would show a profound lack of humanity and sympathy. Instead, he focuses entirely on the external logic.
The environment, the societal structures just pressing down on them from the outside.
Yeah, so think of it like this. The internal struggles someone faces, their mental health, their personal capacity for stress, their grief, that is the explosive material packed inside the time bomb.
Okay.
But as long as the external pressures of society don't trigger it, the bomb doesn't go off. It can be suppressed, maybe over time it can even be slowly diffused. But if the external pressure is too great, it acts as the spark. Boom. So the question that drives the sociological critique in this whole essay is, okay, let's unpack this. What exactly is the detonator in these two cases? What was the external force that lit the fuse?
And this is where it gets really controversial. According to Xu Feng, the detonator is the very thing most of us consider foundational to a healthy society. He places the blame squarely on the traditional family life pattern.
I have to admit, I'm really struggling with this leap he's making. Sure, poverty isolates people, we know that. But to blame the concept of the family itself,
It sounds counterintuitive.
it feels like blaming the life raft because the ocean is stormy, you know. How does he logically justify making the family structure the villain here, rather than just extreme poverty?
To understand his logic, we have to look really closely at the math of the specific circumstances he details. Take young Gailan. She wasn't just experiencing abstract poverty, she was structurally isolated and mathematically crushed by the demands of the traditional family model.
Mathematically crushed.
Yes. The text points out she was the sole caretaker for an aging grandmother, a father, and 4 young children. And the text also notes her husband was too honest to make money.
Meaning he couldn't navigate the cutthroat competitive reality of their local economy.
Right. And because of that, she became the singular load-bearing pillar for 6 other human beings.
Wow. 6 people entirely dependent on one person who is already in poverty.
Exactly. And here is where Shuifeng's critique of the family structure really sharpens. He points out something vital about her community. Her relatives, her friends, her neighbors in the village, they all had their own traditional families to worry about. They had their own localized difficulties to manage.
So they couldn't help her even if they wanted to.
Exactly. In the traditional structure, every family is its own isolated island of responsibility.
This actually leads to an incredibly profound insight in the text about the neighbor's breadcrumbs.
Yes, that part is so striking.
When Yang Gailan started to really drown under the weight of her family, the neighbors could only offer minor help, like a little bit of food, a temporary favor here and there. It isn't that the neighbors lacked compassion, it's that empathy is bankrupted by structural isolation.
Bankrupted by structural isolation. That's a great way to put it.
The traditional model mathematically prevents them from solving her fundamental problem. If they take on her burdens, their own family island sinks.
Right. The structure forces everyone to look out for their own blood first. And when you look at Wu Huaiyan's situation, it was a totally different kind of tragedy, but structurally, it is the exact same failure of the family model.
Because she had no safety net.
None. Her parents had passed away. She was left caring for a younger brother who suffered from severe mental illness. She was physically weak herself. The traditional family structure dictates that you rely on your parents for a safety net, but because she had none, she bore the entire weight of her and her brother's survival completely alone.
There was no broader communal net to catch her at all. The isolation is the feature, not a bug, of the system she was in.
Which is exactly what led to her starving herself on chili rice for 5 years until her body just gave out. Zwifeng's logic culminates in this realization. In a traditional family structure, if the main breadwinner falls, or if the burden simply becomes mathematically too heavy for the able-bodied members, the entire house collapses.
The isolation built into the nuclear family is the real trap.
Yes. When someone is trapped like that, a task that might seem incredibly easy to a well-supported person becomes an insurmountable chasm or an unscalable mountain.
There is a deep, resonant vein of empathy in the text here that really stuck with me. Lifechanyuan writes that anyone, even himself, might collapse or take the exact same tragic path if they were forced to walk in those shoes.
He's very clear about that.
He specifically warns the reader that no one should dare to boast about their own resilience. He notes that if personal grit were enough, millions of people wouldn't commit suicide globally every year. We all have a breaking point when we are completely structurally isolated.
And recognizing that universal breaking point is what transitions Wefeng from just diagnosing a sociological problem to proposing a radical alternative.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because this is where we really get into the weeds of his ideology. If the nuclear family is this isolated trap waiting to be sprung by poverty or illness, what is the escape route?
The alternative he proposes is a specific communal living model called the New Oasis for Life, which was created by an organization known as Lifechanyuan.
The new oasis.
Yeah, and Xufeng makes a bold, unequivocal claim here. He states that if Yang Gailan and Wu Huaiyan had lived in this new oasis system, their tragedies absolutely would not have happened.
That is a massive claim to make about real-world deaths.
It's huge.
How does this oasis actually function mechanically to prevent that kind of despair? Like, if I'm thinking about the traditional nuclear family as a tiny localized pressure cooker where all the financial stress, emotional labor, and physical exhaustion is contained tightly in this one little pot until it explodes, the new oasis sounds like taking that pot and venting the pressure out into a massive community-wide system.
That analogy fits the mechanics he describes perfectly. According to the text, individuals in this system do not marry.
Wait, they don't marry at all?
No. They do not form traditional nuclear families at all.
So they just bypass the entire concept of the nuclear family.
Entirely.
But logically, if you dissolve the family unit, where does the labor and the cost of living go? Someone still has to pay for things and do the work.
It goes entirely to the collective. Instead of building isolated household units, individuals incorporate themselves into an entirely new mode of production. In the new oasis, the home, which now means the broader community itself, bears all the costs of living.
The entire community is the home.
Yes. The text explicitly lists the major burdens that typically crush people: the support and care of the elderly, the education of the children, and the expenses of medical care. The community absorbs all of it.
Okay, so applying that to the tragedies we discussed. The insurmountable chasm Yang Galen faced, caring for the elderly and the young simultaneously with absolutely no money. That burden is completely lifted from her individual shoulders.
Gone.
It is distributed across the labor and resources of the entire community.
Exactly. And the same applies to Wu Huaiyan. Her illness and her brother's care would not have been her sole responsibility to bear until she starved to death.
Wow.
The author describes this communal structure as a mechanism that allows literally anyone to easily get through life's difficulties. By removing the isolated financial burdens, it eliminates the conditions that breed despair, resulting in what he actually calls a paradisiacal life compared to the sea of hardship outside.
A paradisiacal life. But so what does this all mean? If this giant pressure release valve exists, and if it functions as this paradise on Earth, it begs the ultimate question. Why aren't people taking this road? Why are millions still drowning in that sea of hardship?
And this brings us to Xufeng's historical and political critique. He focuses specifically on the working people in China for this part. He argues that they have historically placed their expectations for a better life on the wrong systemic solutions.
The wrong solutions.
Right. Specifically, he says they mistakenly rely on the hope for wise emperors or clean and efficient governments.
Okay, just a quick reminder for you listening. As we mentioned at the top of the deep dive, we are stepping firmly into the author's political viewpoints here. We are impartially exploring his assertion that relying on systemic government reform is a dead end. We aren't validating it, we're just unpacking his historical perspective.
Right. And his perspective is rooted in a deep historical cynicism about state intervention. He points out that for thousands of years, right up into our modernized, technologically advanced era, tragedies exactly like the ones we discussed are still happening.
Constantly.
So therefore, the strategy of waiting for a perfectly clean government or a remarkably wise leader to come along and fix the social safety net has empirically failed over and over again.
He's saying basically stop waiting for the state to save you because history proves it won't. And honestly, relying on a politician to permanently eradicate poverty does feel like waiting for a mythical savior.
He believes that instead of depending on broader society or, spending all your energy condemning the government or lamenting the indifference of neighbors, the individual needs to take radical action and walk away entirely.
Walk away from society.
Walk away from the structure. The solution, in his view, isn't to try and patch the holes in the traditional structure. The solution is to abandon the structure entirely for this new oasis model.
I can follow the logic up to this point. I mean, it's a huge paradigm shift from systemic reform to communal secession, but it makes a certain kind of logical sense.
Sure.
But then the text takes a turn that gives me, like, conversational whiplash.
Oh, the spiritual pivot.
Yes. Up to this point, the author has been incredibly grounded. He's doing sociological critiques, talking about modes of production, and showing deep empathy for people crushed by poverty. But then he pivots to this intense spiritual dimension, and it feels like a very sharp, almost harsh ultimatum. I get lost here. How do we reconcile this shift from economics to theology?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a striking rhetorical pivot, but it is actually the cornerstone of his entire philosophy. He introduces a spiritual framing to close his argument, stating that the greatest creator, gods, Buddha, celestials, and saints, they all genuinely care about the working people.
Okay.
They are not indifferent to human suffering.
So he is explicitly saying the divine, however you define it, is actively engaged in our well-being.
Yes. And his proof of their care is that they have provided the blueprint for the escape route. He claims the divine forces have inspired or created this idyllic, new oasis life mode so that people can live well.
Like they handed down the solution.
Exactly. They have done their part by offering the communal solution to the structural problem.
Which sets up the harsh reality he drops at the very end of the essay. He essentially says, okay, the gods provided the way out, but if people don't listen, if they stubbornly refuse to abandon their nuclear families and walk this communal path, it is no longer the fault of society or the state or the gods.
Right.
He writes that if we suffer now, it is because we deserve it, which is a really heavy, jarring thing to read after the profound empathy he showed Yang and Wu at the beginning.
It is jarring. He removes the blame from the abstract concepts of fate or structural oppression and places it squarely on individual choice. He argues that we are ultimately trapped by our own selfish calculations.
Selfish calculations.
Yeah.
That feels like a direct attack on the ego.
It absolutely is. He is critiquing the inherent desire to have our own private family, our own isolated wealth, our own little kingdom separate from everyone else. Even if that kingdom is crumbling and causing us immense suffering, we cling to the ownership of it.
Wow. He literally concludes the essay with the phrase, selfishness decides everything.
Yeah.
The visual that creates is haunting. He is basically saying, the door to the cage is wide open, the community is waiting right outside to absorb your burdens, but our selfish attachment to the traditional family model is the very padlock keeping us trapped inside.
It forces the reader to confront their deepest attachments. It challenges you to ask whether the things you are holding on to for security are actually the weights dragging you underwater.
This has been an incredibly intense journey through the sources today. We started by looking at real-world tragedies, not just as distant, sanitized news stories, but as books without words, raw, unfiltered data on the limits of human endurance. We unpack how the author identifies the traditional nuclear family not as a safety net, but as an isolating trap that bankrupts empathy and places explosive burdens on individuals. And we followed his logic all the way from communal economics to a spiritual ultimatum, warning that our own selfish calculations are what keep us suffering.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is. It really makes you reflect on the localized safety nets you rely on in your own life. Are you trusting in systems that mathematically guarantee collapse if just one single pillar gives way?
We have spent centuries championing the independent nuclear family as the ultimate symbol of stability and success. But if a structure only truly protects you when everything is going right and actively isolates you when things go wrong, we have to ask ourselves, is it actually a shelter or is it just a trap waiting to be sprung?
That is the profound, unsettling question you are left with today. Usually when we talk about understanding society, we expect the books and the data to give us clean, comforting answers. But as we've seen, sometimes the most crucial enlightenment comes from reading the messy, heartbreaking, wordless realities of human life. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.